Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of PsychCast. Today we'll be doing something a little different. We won't be talking about a psychology experiment, rather we'll be doing a Unit 1 review. So, before I proceed with the unit review, I'd like to give credit and a shout out to my friend Allison from Bellevue, Washington. She was one that gave me this idea, so shout out to you and thank you. So first, I like to define what exactly psychology is. Psychology is the study of the behavior and of the mind. And while we're at it, behavior is defined as the observable actions of a person or animal. So there you have that. Now let's move on to some of the historical figures that we must acknowledge in the AP Psychology curriculum. Starting off, we have Socrates and Plato. They believed that humans were born with knowledge, so they believed in the idea of innate knowledge. On the contrary side, you have Aristotle, who believed that we obtain knowledge through observing our outside world. Now let's talk about a key idea that emerged during this time, and that is dualism. Dualism is the idea that our body and our mind are separate from each other. And a famous dualist that you should know is René Descartes. Descartes believed that everything in life was predictable. So, for example, he believed that you could observe this paper was going to fall down because of gravity, so it's observable. Except for humans, because we possess the quality of the mind. Now, let's talk about some philosophers you should know. Starting off with John Locke. John Locke developed the theory of empiricism, which is the idea that we acquire knowledge through observation and experience. So this kind of sounds similar to Aristotle, whom we assume that he probably got inspiration from. John Locke also believed in something called tabula rasa, which is Latin for blank slate. And I apologize for butchering that very badly. But basically, to sum it up, John Locke believed that babies were born without knowledge, so born with a blank slate, and that all knowledge must be learned throughout life. Moving on to Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes believed in the idea of materialism, which is that the only thing that exists are matter and energy. So he deemed that the idea of the spirit, of the mind, of the soul, those were all meaningless. Moving on to a scientist now, Charles Darwin. Darwin, as you all know, came up with the idea of natural selection, which is defined as the process in which the organism with the best trait are able to survive in their environment and eventually pass that trait on to their offspring. So you guys might be wondering, how does this relate to psychology? Well, the trait that might be passed on to their offsprings could also include psychological behavior. In other words, natural selection could be an explanation as to why certain organisms behave the way they do. Now let's finally talk about some of the psychologists you should know. Starting off with Wilhelm Wundt, W-U-N-D-T. I'm sorry if I butchered that, but William was the founder of psychology, or he was coined that term, because he opened the first psychological laboratory to study consciousness. And one of William's students, Edward Titchener, actually came up with another school of psychology that we should acknowledge, and that is structuralism. Structuralism is the idea that through understanding smaller components, we can later comprehend the greater structure. So Titchener came up with the idea of introspection through structuralism. Introspection is the process of examining one's own thoughts and feelings during an interview. Now let's talk about William James. William James created functionalism, which is the theory that focuses solely on the function of certain things. And in this case, it will be focused solely on the function of the mind. Now let's move on to the ladies of psychology. Starting off with Dorothea Dix. She founded the first mental hospital and was a big advocate for the mentally ill. Another lady we should acknowledge is Mary Winton Calkins. Calkins. She was the first female graduate student in the field of psychology, but unfortunately, due to her gender, she was denied her PhD. Moving on, we have Margaret Floyd Washburn. Washburn was the first female PhD, and she also served as the second female president of the American Psychology Association, otherwise known as APA, with G. Stanley Hall serving as the first president of APA. Let's talk about the approaches that you should know for AP Psychology. So there is a cool mnemonic tool that I would like to share with you guys, and that involves using your hand. So let's start off. If you're looking at a visual version, just point your thumb out, and if you're listening to the audio, just follow along. So have your fingers as in like a thumbs up position, And I want you to point your thumb to the back of your head. This motion here signalizes the psychoanalytic approach. Now, psychoanalytic approach is the idea that the unconscious mind leads to our behaviors, and that events from early childhood also shape our behaviors. Let's say, for example, when you were 4 years old, you got bitten by a dog. But that memory is now buried in your unconscious. And as you grow older to become adults, you have this innate fear of dogs, yet you don't know why you have this fear of dogs. And that's because the memory of you getting bitten by a dog is buried in your mind and you don't recall it. While we're at it, the definition of the unconscious mind is the mental process that we don't have access to, but still shapes our behaviors, thoughts, and feelings. And a key psychologist that we should mention and remember in association with the psychoanalytic approach is Sigmund Freud, aka my favorite psychologist. Freud is the founder of psychoanalytic, and I am very excited to tell you guys more about his later crazy theories in future unit reviews, and I'm sure Tony is as well. So again, I want you guys to associate the movement of having your thumb pointing to the back of your head as psychoanalytic, because when you're pointing back, it's almost as if you're pointing to your early childhood, back in the time. So again, with your thumb, you need to memorize that this is the psychoanalytic approach in AP Psychology. Moving on with your index finger. I want you to point your index finger to your temple. And this movement right here signalizes the cognitive approach. Cognitive approach basically is concerned with understanding how we think and our mental processes. So pretty straightforward. Moving on to the anticipated middle finger. The middle finger is associated with behavioralist psychology, which is rooted in behaviorism. Behaviorism is the view that psychology should be studied without any reference to the mental process, and instead should solely focus on the observable behaviors. A key psychologist to know in the behaviorist psychology field is Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov is coined as the father of classical conditioning, which is a process that we have actually dedicated a full episode on, so please go check it out. And to sum it up in a nutshell, classical conditioning basically is the process in which one associates an involuntary response to a stimulus. Again, for more information, check out episode 4. Another psychologist that is prominent in the field of behavioralist psychology is B.F. Skinner, who is the father of operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is basically when you associate a behavior with an environmental outcome. So an example would be, let's say if a mouse was in a cage, and this is actually an experiment that B.F. Skinner have done. Let's say there is a mouse in a cage and there is a lever. Every time the mouse presses the lever, a food comes out. Because of this reinforcement that the food will come out, the mouse will keep pressing the lever. And so there you go, operant conditioning. Last psychologist to know in the field of behavioralist psychology is John B. Watson, who also was interested in researching about classical conditioning and created the experiment, the Little Albert experiment. So next time someone points a middle finger at you, hopefully you'll remember behavioralist psychology. Moving on to your ring finger. I don't have one, but oftentimes people will wear their wedding ring on their ring finger. And the wedding ring is a symbol of love and fulfillment, which leads right into the humanistic psychology approach. Humanistic psychology approach is basically an approach that studies the role of consciousness, free will, and awareness of human condition. And this approach emphasizes fulfillment and personal goals and how that will influence our behavior. Two notable psychologists in this field is Abraham Maslow, who is the founder of the idea of self-actualization, meaning you accept yourself and your nature while knowing your limits and your strengths. Another notable psychologist is Carl Roger, who came up with the idea of unconditional positive regard, meaning you have complete acceptance of someone, no matter what they did. Now, the last finger left is your pinky. And if you didn't know, your pinky is actually roughly the size of your brainstem, which leads right into the biological approach in the field of psychology. So the biological approach, as you can kind of guess from the name, focuses on the relationship between anatomy and physiology with behavior. So for instance, in the field of biological psychology, you might be concerned with how a certain imbalance of brain chemicals might lead to certain behaviors, and how an increase in a certain chemical may lead to a mental illness. Now you might be thinking, okay, we've ran out of fingers. That should be all the approach, right? Unfortunately, no. You still have your palm. And what is a palm? Palm is when you raise your palm up, usually it signals you want a high five. And this leads into the socio-cultural approach in the field of psychology, which is the belief that the environment someone grows in shapes their thoughts and behaviors. So let's say if you grew up in an environment where people were high-fiving each other and raising their palm in midair, you'll learn that, oh, when you high-five someone, that's like a sign of encouragement and a sign of good job. And then next time you see someone that does a good job, you'll raise your palm and give them a high five. So again, your environment influences your behavior. Now you might be thinking, this should be the end of it, right? Unfortunately, no, again, we still have the fist. The fist symbolizes strength and survival of the fittest, all of that. So it leads right into the evolutionary aspect or the evolutionary approach in the field of psychology, which basically describes how our behaviors help us survive. So again, it taps into natural selection, Charles Darwin, all the things I've mentioned in the beginning of this episode. Although we've now ran out of things on our hand, there's still one more approach that we must mention, and that's the biopsychosocial approach. As you can tell, it's basically a combination of the biological approach, your psychological approach, as well as your sociological approach. So it's just an agglomeration of all the different approaches. So those are all of the psychological approaches you should know, and that concludes today's unit review. Please stick around for part 2, because part 2, we will be talking about the experiment, vocabularies that you should know, for instance, independent variables, dependent variables, standard deviation, all of that good stuff. I'm going to leave those to Tony, and he will explain it in the next episode. So please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And yes, we are on YouTube, but we are also available on all podcast platforms. So please support us, and thank you for listening to today's podcast, and I hope you have a great day.